So I'm really excited to share with you some of the things that I really look forward to look out for and to listen for as spring unfolds during March and April. And so thank you so much for joining us. So one of those first sounds that I love listening for in March is the Peter, Peter, Peter call of the tufted titmouse. We started hearing that in early March. I hope some of you have heard that near your home. And if you didn't know who was calling and you hear that Peter, Peter, Peter call, that's the tufted titmouse starting to change from the calls that you might have heard at your bird feeders this winter to the song, the sort of territorial establishment song and the mating song to attract the female. Sap buckets, damp earth, wildflowers, there are lots and lots of early signs of spring that I know we all look forward to seeing. Despite the unpredictability of weather in March, there is a certain predictability and dependability of these signs of spring as they unfold. In many cultures, the calendar year, the new year really begins in March. And I'd like to read a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass. The new moon ushers in our Anishinaabe New Year, the maple sugar moon. It is when the earth starts to wake up from her well-deserved rest and renews her gifts to the people. And for us, seeing a lot of this rebirth and these new beginnings is really a hopeful sign, and March is really synonymous with the rebirth of the earth, especially in New England. In fact, if we go back a couple of hundred years ago, the early colonists used a totally different calendar, and March 25th was the start of the new year up until the 1750s. Then we switched to the Gregorian calendar, which is what we use today, but in many cultures throughout the North especially, March marks the beginning of the new year. Oh, I want to go back, and here is another sound that I absolutely love. It's one of my favorite bird calls. It's the song of the northern cardinal. So we've started to hear that as well during the past few weeks. So our first wildflower of the year, skunk cabbage. So I was really wanting to see some signs of spring, especially the first week of March this year. It was very cold, lots of snow, ice, and I think the weather was in the teens with the wind chill. And I went to Barton Cove because I know I can always depend on seeing the skunk cabbage at Barton Cove. And there it was, coming up through the ice, coming up through the snow. This maroon hood that you see is called the spathe. That protects the flower. That odd looking structure is actually the flower inside that maroon hoodie. It's a very unusual plant, and it's able to flower so early because it generates its own heat. It uses a process called thermogenesis. So what it does is it generates its own heat, it absorbs oxygen to produce heat and burns sugar at a high rate so it can vary its metabolism. So inside that little maroon structure, what I call the maroon hoodie, technically it's called the spathe, it can maintain a temperature of 68 degrees for about Fahrenheit for about 2.5 weeks. That heat helps the flower develop, it helps it break through the snow, and it also really helps it with pollination. So this is a wildflower that is pollinated primarily by flies. It wants to attract flies. And if you want to attract flies, you want to sort of pretend that you're rotting meat. You want to pretend that you're carrion. So this dark maroon color is the same color as rotting meat. And the smell that the plant emits, especially if it's bruised, whether it's the leaf or the flower, that structure, smells like rotting meat as well. So it's trying to attract these early pollinators, these insects, and there are not many insects out in early March. It serves as a wetland warming hut because it generates that heat inside. Insects know that, they smell that, they are are attracted to the heat, they can warm up their flight muscles. So it's also pollinated by other animals other than flies, other insects other than flies. So it serves as a wetland warming hut. It grows in wetlands and marshes, and is a dependable sign of spring. You can go to Barton Cove and check it out. And so our first wildflower is up of the year. So this is that same plant about a month later. So by the time we get into April, the marshes and wetlands will just be carpeted with this bright, bright green leaf. These green leaves can grow up to 2 to 3 feet tall. And if you see tucked down at the base of that leaf that's unfolding on the right, you'll see the flower structure that's starting to dissolve. These green leaves, most of us can't eat. We can't eat, most mammals can't eat, and a lot of other animals can't eat. They have calcium oxalate crystals in them. And what that does is it causes, so if I were to eat it, it would cause a burning sensation in my mouth and in my throat. It might swell. And so it's a great deterrent for being browsed. But there's some animals, include Canada goose, wood duck, and especially the black bear, that can feed on the leaves of skunk cabbage. In fact, skunk cabbage is a really important food for black bear in April. They're starting to emerge soon or have already from their hibernation. The females may have young with them, and they really need to provide a lot of food. They're extremely hungry after that deep sleep that they have spent all winter in. Even if there are acorns around, acorns are an important food for black bear, but skunk cabbage is also, and they found that over 50% of a black bear's diet in April or in the spring is skunk cabbage leaves. So also at Barton Cove, as I look not down at the ground, but look up, are bald eagles. We've had nesting bald eagles on Barton Island since 1989. And the eagles are on their nest now. They're another pretty dependable early sign of spring. So Bill Dean has been a great friend of Northfield Mountain and of Barton Cove. He's a photographer, and he visits the Barton Cove nests on a frequent basis, takes videos, takes photographs, shares them with us. He has a website and a link that you'll see at the bottom of the screen. We'll also share that link with you in an email that will follow up on this presentation. So you can check out the status of the Barton Cove nests throughout the spring and summer. So what Bill observed, on February 22nd, he observed the eagles mating. Usually 5 to 10 days after that, they lay eggs. Spot on, by March 3rd, they were incubating the nest. So you can see a change in the eagle behavior. All of a sudden, they're down, one of them is down in the nest. Usually it's the female, although both the male and female will take turns incubating that egg. Trying to keep that egg warm for 35 days. So for 5 weeks, one of them is constantly sitting on that egg. They have a brood patch, which is a spot that doesn't have feathers on their abdomen. A lot of warm blood vessels can keep those eggs warm. And hopefully, in the first week of April, we will have at least one, if not more, chicks hatch from those eggs. We'll see. We'll keep you in touch on that. So some of us don't get excited if we get snow in March, but we may. If you think of it, it's a great opportunity for tracking. So in early March, this was last week, took a walk, and because there's often not a lot of deep snow and the snow is quite soft, it can make for great tracking and really good foot impressions of, a lot of different animals, a lot of different wildlife that we have around here. So this track you can see by the Swiss Army knife is about 6 inches by 6 inches, a pretty big hoof. Those 2 toes I see a lot. There are moose tracks. But what I don't always get to see is the dew claws, those 2 smaller imprints that you'll see below those 2 toes. So it can also be just a great time. And on top of the snow, March is a good time to see snow fleas. They show up, those little black, tiny, tiny animals show up because of the contrast with the white. They're around year-round, they're active year-round. We just don't always see them. They're not as easy to see in the rest of the year because they're not on this white background. Springtails or snow fleas, they're sort of nicknamed snow fleas around here. Springtails are from a pretty ancient group of animals called Collembola. They used to be grouped as insects, and they've now put them in a related and separate evolutionary line with insect group as a Collembola or springtail. They're about less than 1/10 of an inch. So they're really tiny, tiny invertebrates. They almost look like someone spattered pepper on top of snow. But if you look really closely at them, you're going to see them moving. And in fact, you'll see them just like spring up and almost disappear. They're extremely prevalent in our forests, and they play a very important ecological role. They're so plentiful that they estimate that sort of supporting every step you take in the forest, there are about 7,000 springtails down in the leaf litter and underneath. They're a very important decomposer. So they recycle nutrients, feeding on fungi and algae, and that stimulates the interaction between the fungi and certain plants that live in the forest. And they found when there's a lot of springtails, there's more productive plant growth. So they're very important and often overlooked. So they're pretty cool to watch. Again, they're 1/10 of an inch, so we're not going to see this detail. But the spring comes from the fricula, which is sort of the springtail, that appendage that's in red in the picture, and it's usually hinged up underneath its abdomen and sort of clasped when it needs to move, perhaps for predation, perhaps for movement and migration to a different environment or moister area. That springtail is inflated, goes down to the ground, and with the tension and the pressure, catapults it up into the air. So relative to sort of our size, if you can imagine jumping up 80 stories high. So that's almost all the way up the Empire State Building. So compared to its size, it's able to jump that high and not only jump up, but land safely. So what it has is these 3 air sacs, that it inflates and sort of emits from inside its body to cushion the landing. And then those air sacs are retrieved back into the body, just like automobile airbags. They're fun to look for, and I often see them a lot in the spring on the leaf litter if you look closely. And we're having our songbirds are starting to return. So this we've heard both in the valley and up in the hills. Red-winged blackbird, it's just a great sound. It's like, welcome back. You've come back from areas farther south. It has a song that sounds like conclary. So this is the male of the red-winged blackbird. The female is more brown and black mottled, and she'll come back a little bit later. The male comes back first, which is true with a number of the birds. Those beautiful red and yellow sort of shoulder epaulets are really showy. It's singing now. It's starting to establish its territory. It nests in marshes, and it's just a great sound to hear. Another of our returning migrants from farther south are the eastern bluebirds. We also have a lot of bluebirds that stay around here in the winter as well, but we're starting to see bluebirds also coming back from the south. They're really a revered bird. They're featured in songs, featured in poems, featured in writing. Just a beautiful, beautiful bird, and I enjoy John Burroughs' description of it. When nature made the bluebird, she wished to propitiate both the sky and the earth. So she gave him the color of the one on his back and the hue of the other on his breast. And let's hear its song, because I'm starting to hear not just its call now, but its song as well. And this is the male. Bluebirds are cavity nesters, as a number of the other birds that we'll see later on. So their nests, they're looking for holes in a tree, holes in a hollow tree, holes in a live tree, or a tree that's part of it is dead. That's what bluebird boxes simulate. A lot of people have bluebird boxes up because they're trying to imitate a snag or a cavity nest, a hole in a tree. So if you do have bluebird boxes around, it's a good time now to clean them out, because the males are starting to move around from the boxes and starting to stake out their territories. Here's another great early sign of spring. I've seen some around so far. I'm very lucky to have Beth, who's the host for the program tonight. My coworker, Beth Pelton, she's also a beautiful photographer. And I'm lucky to be able to use her picture of the pussy willow tonight in the presentation. So what you're seeing is these silver soft hairs that cover the buds of the pussy willow. It's a type of a willow tree, one species of willow tree. There are about 100 willows in North America, different kinds, and this is one of them. And those soft silver hairs on those buds insulate that flower. The flower's inside, it helps it warm up and it helps it come out very early, and it's one of the earliest tree flowers that we'll see. Just starting to see a lot of migrating waterfowl return. The river's been iced up, at least up in Franklin County, and it just started to break up. So it was pretty much a lot of ice in this area, around the Northfield area, even 2 weeks ago, even 1 week ago. And it's recently started to break up, which is great, because that means now there's a lot more space for the waterfowl. And it also means a good sign that spring is coming. Recently, there have been sightings of common golden eyes, which is featured here. This is the male, scops, ringneck ducks, and a number of other migrating waterfowl are starting to sort of stop over in the Connecticut River. They're eating, they're resting, and they're refueling themselves before they continue northward. So they don't breed here. They're going to continue northward to the specific habitat that they breed in. We're also starting to see other migrating waterfowl that are coming. Many of them will continue north and continue on to other areas, but some of them will stay here and breed. So we're also starting not only to get back some of our songbirds that are returning from areas south, but also some of our waterfowl that nest here as well. This is the male common merganser. Starting to see them, they're pretty distinctive because they're bright, bright, bright white, and they're a pretty large duck. And so we're starting to see a lot of them, and we'll see a lot more in the next few weeks. This is a great little bird that, again, in ponds, lakes, river areas where the ice is gone, they've started to show up, and they show up as a pair. They're an early nester, so they pair up in their wintering grounds and then arrive as a pair. This is the male hooded merganser, and just to show you what the female looks like, she looks quite different. In many of these birds, the male has the showy plumage. It's to attract a mate, it's to stake out its territory, whereas the female is the one primarily responsible for raising the young, in this case, totally responsible for raising the young, incubating the eggs, and taking care of the young. So she wants to be a lot more camouflaged in color. So hooded mergansers, as the eastern bluebird and as some of the other birds that we'll see, are cavity nesters. So the merganser is looking for a hole in a tree near a wetland. They're not going to make the hole, so they're going to use an old woodpecker hole or another available hole that they find. So they're just starting to back, at least up in the hills, they're just starting to return. And they're going to be returning in pairs, and they're just a really fun bird to look for. And here's a bird that a lot of people love seeing. This is the male. Like the hooded merganser, the female has more drab plumage, so she can camouflage better. So the male wood ducks are just starting to return. The female, they're returning as a pair. So wood ducks are starting to be seen. We'll see a lot more of them in the coming month. They nest in cavities, just like the hooded merganser. And so as they return, they're resting, they're refueling in the water, and they're also starting to stake out and figure out where they're going to nest, what cavity, what hole in a tree they want. They can be up to 50 feet high, which is pretty high. Usually it's about 25 feet or so. So a typical wood duck, a nest would be a hole in a tree, 25 feet high, could be up to a mile from the wetland. And so when the young wood ducks, the male will disappear after mating. The female is sitting on the eggs, incubating the eggs. She'll leave twice a day to feed herself. And then as soon as they hatch, so these young are 1 day old, they'll jump out of that hole in the tree. Imagine jumping off the roof of a two-story building. They'll not only jump off the roof of a two-story building, they're one day all these tiny little fluffy ducks, and then they may hike a mile over land to their new wetland home. It could be a beaver pond, a shrubby swamp where they will feed and grow. So this is a great duck to look for. And another favorite, as we get later on in March and in early April, we'll start to see more, is the common loon returning. They nest here in Quabbin Reservoir, which is great. We can often hear them and see them. And just to play one of the calls, their tremolo call that they use to sort of keep in contact with each other. I can't wait to hear that again this year. So this is my favorite, the American woodcock. I have gone out, so we live at an elevation of about 1,100 feet, and we still have quite a bit of snow. And I've gone out, you know, almost every night the past couple weeks and listened for the woodcock, and have heard nothing. I know in the valley, they've been performing their performance for a couple of weeks. So this is just a great thing. To me, it's a highlight of spring. So this is a woodpecker, not a woodpecker. It is a sandpiper, but it's moved inland. It's sort of a fat, stocky little sandpiper. Some of the woodcocks that are coming through here are migrating. They'll continue north, and a number of them are going to stay here. So the males are staking out a territory, and then they want to attract a female. And so what I want to share is sort of where to look for them, when to look for them, and what to look for and listen for. So it's a courtship of the American woodcock, and it's an aerial display by the male. And it takes place in their singing grounds. And on the left, what you're going to look for is an abandoned field, could be a farm field. You want nearby, you want a lot of alders, so you want some wet area. And you also want an early successional forest, and because that's where they're going to nest. So they need nesting areas, the young forest. They need feeding area, damp, muddy ground. Alders are a good indicator. And where they stick that bill, that long, long, long bill, probe it down into the earth, looking for earthworms as well as other invertebrates. And so you want the nesting, the wet area, or the young forest, the wet area for feeding, and the singing ground. So about 10 acres or so. So an open area, about 10 acres, though I have seen them perform in smaller areas, that's about 5 acres. So it could be a grassy, fieldy area. They're really quite common. And probably one of the easiest ways is just to listen for them. So when are you going to go? About 20 minutes or so after sunset. So sunset now is around 7 o'clock at night. I've read 22 minutes, 21 minutes, and that's if it's clear. If it's not clear, if it's cloudy, then it's going to be earlier because it's really all about the amount of light. So, you know, start listening about 15 minutes after sunset, or it could be, 20 minutes before sunrise, but I prefer to go out after sunset. And you might hear one near you, and it's a great thing to listen for. So what are you going to look and listen for? So this is a singing ground, and the woodcock, let me get out, I'm going to get this little laser pointer. All right, there we go. So the woodcock is going to start here on the ground in the singing, on the singing ground. And he's going to do this peep call. It's like beep, beep. May repeat it 10 times, may repeat it 20 times, can be 30. It's really quite variable on the night and by the individual. So knowing the sound is a great sort of indicator because that's going to be a woodcock. And then it's going to take off. And it takes off at a low angle, and that's why it needs an area, an open area of about, 10 acres, but it can be smaller. And as it takes off, it does this huge loops way up in the sky. And it makes a sound called a wing twitter, which is the sound, this whistling sound of the air going through the wings. They initially thought it was singing. And then when it gets to the top, it changes. The song changes and it starts, it's the wing twitter, but it also starts just warbling its little heart out. This is a male doing this incredible song and dance to try to get a female's attention. And so it does this singing and warbling all the way down, and then there's silence, and then it lands right where it started and starts all over again. So I'll start with the peat sound, which it's doing on the ground. And then it's going to take off in the air. And then it's going to land back where it started and start over with the peat. So this song and dance may last 30 to 40 minutes on a night, and it may repeat that whole scenario maybe a dozen times. Again, it's quite variable. If there's a full moon, you can continue. So again, woodcock have been seen performing and heard performing in the valley, up in the hills, any day now, any evening now, I expect to hear them. And they'll continue this, through April. So it's a great thing to get out and look for and listen for in the next few weeks. The phoebe should be returning any day now. This is, again, a songbird that's returning. It has a song that says its name. It goes Phoebe, Phoebe. It's smaller than a robin, and it's pretty distinctive with its tail wagging. It tends to pump its tail. It's just a behavioral characteristic that makes identifying it quite easy. It nests in our barn every year. They often use human-made structures to sort of simulate a protected shelf, a cliff. In the woods, they would be nesting like on under an overhung rock. And they make this nest of mud and grass, and they usually return to the same place every year. At Northfield, on the back balcony that faces the pond at the visitor center, there is always a phoebe nesting under that back deck. Vernal Pools, again, a highlight of spring right up there with the sky dance or the woodcock. So vernal pools are small, temporary ponds. They can vary in size. The common denominator with vernal pools is that they're temporary. So at some point during the year, there's a good chance that they'll dry up. And often the most common situation is in summer. By midsummer, a lot of them will be dried up and you wouldn't even notice them. One of the key things is that they're fish free, and that's because they dry up, because there are temporary fish normally need a year-round pond. So because they're fish free, that eliminates a significant predator on amphibian eggs and their larvae. So that's one of the reasons that certain animals have evolved to breed in these vernal pools, but because they're temporary, it's a race against time. So those eggs have to develop, the tadpoles have to develop, and the animal has to be able to leave as an adult before that pool dries up. So the first time I came across a vernal pool, I was walking in the woods and I heard this noise. And so I snuck up to the pool. I had my binoculars. I looked everywhere. They're often pretty small. I could see the entire pool. Couldn't see a thing. Couldn't find a duck. There was no duck. And I stayed for quite a while. I couldn't figure it out. And finally, they started quacking again. And I realized I wasn't listening to ducks, I was listening to frogs. So this frog blends in very well camouflaged on the forest floor. It's just about 2 to 3 inches, has a sort of a mask, a bandit mask like a raccoon. And it's our first amphibian, our earliest amphibian around here that migrates in early spring to these vernal pools to breed. Another animal that migrates to these vernal pools to breed is a spotted salamander. This is just a great animal. It's about 6 to 9 inches long, bright yellow polka dots that can live up to 20 years. And they are the salamander that move in sort of what's called the big night. So there'll be rain. I don't see anything happening in the next week or so. I did look ahead of the forecast, but it could be in late March, early April. It's going to be earlier in the valley, later up in the hills. Of a good soaking rain, that first really good soaking rain, it's going to start in the afternoon, continue on into the night, and the temperature is going to be around the mid-40s. Could be warmer, but at minimum mid-40s, perhaps low 40s. And that soaking rain and those salamanders are going to merge from their winter home, merge from their year-round home, because this is the only time when you really see them, and migrate to the same pool, that same vernal pool that they were born in. They can do the same trip every year to the pool and then return to their forest home, which is down, in the forest litter for perhaps 20 years in a row. So if you're looking at a pool, in a vernal pool, and you see different egg masses, they look sort of like clustered jelly, clear jelly. That's another way to know that's a vernal pool. And wood frog egg masses are usually quite a lot larger. They're individual egg masses stuck together, so they have more of a bumpy appearance, and there can be up to about 2,000 eggs in a wood frog egg mass. Spotted salamander eggs are much smaller. There will be about 250 or so, and there's a surrounding gelatinous material that sort of covers and protects those spotted salamander eggs. I think of them as spotted salamander starts with an S, and that gelatinous surrounding, so the surround starts with an S. That's just the way I remember them. But often you'll see both of these in the same pond. But they're a fun thing to look for in April. And then you'll know that that's a pond that wood frogs and spotted salamanders breed in. So in the woods, a really neat shrub to look for in April is the beaked hazelnut. This is the male that you see, those catkins hanging down, wind pollinated, leaves aren't out to block the pollen from blowing. And the real highlight for me is the female, is the beaked hazelnut flower. It's tiny. It's just about 1/4 of an inch and absolutely beautiful. It's this pink magenta. It's just a beautiful color, an exquisite little flower. And it's pretty much otherwise a brown, sort of drab, deciduous forest in April. There's not a lot of color around, and so this color is all the more special. This is much easier to find and much easier to notice. The flowers of the red maple, they're starting to swell right now. The red maple buds are starting to swell. They'll continue to swell as the weather warms up in the next couple weeks, and those flowers will break out. If you look at a red maple tree in April, and they can look quite different. Some of them can be in all male flowers. Some of them can be covered with all female flowers, and some, though less common, can have both. So this is the male flower, and it'll have a more orangey cast because of the yellow of the pollen, whereas the female flowers will have a more reddish cast. So as you're walking around during April, keep an eye out for red maples. Binoculars can be a great tool to look at flower buds up high, and you may notice different colors, and you may be able to see, oh, that's a male tree, or oh, that's a female tree. So springtails, I'm going to return to springtails because I came across last spring in mid-April about 6 springtail migrations. I had never seen them before. It was over the course of about a week or two, and it would be about 20 feet long, semicircular, and about a foot wide, and it would just be this mass of black, tiny springtails. And these are these tiny animals that are less than 1/10 of an inch. And there would just be millions of them moving, all in the same direction, little bit by little bit. As I was researching these migrations after seeing them, they appear for a couple of days. So they just emerge from the forest floor. They'll have this migration for a couple of days, and then they'll disappear again. We just happened to be, luckily come across them, but that was a really fun thing to see. And again, mid-April seems to be a common time in this year. So here's a video of the springtails jumping. All right, so moving on to more obvious signs of spring. Morning cloaks, the butterflies will be emerging, perhaps the end of March, but more likely in April. We'll see how quickly things warm up. Morning cloaks are able to, they're one of our first butterflies that emerge because they overwinter as an adult, whereas most butterflies around here overwinter as an egg or as a pupa and a chrysalis. And so they have to go through either one or two steps of metamorphosis before they can emerge as an adult. But the morning cloak is already overwintered as an adult. So we should see those soon. And one catch with emerging so early is that they're nectar eaters, and there's very, very little nectar around in early spring, and that's a challenge. And so they'll mostly depend on sap early on, sap from broken branches and trees, and oak seems to be their preferred. Chipmunks, active, their young will be active, we'll start seeing them, we already are seeing them. Spring peepers on the right, it's a tiny little tree frog, maybe an inch. And if you do see one on the ground, you'll see that brown X on the back, and that'll help you identifying it. Gutter snakes will also start to emerge. So now we're getting into sort of late March and early April. Pine warblers should be coming back. This is a great sound to listen for if you're walking in the woods and you're near a lot of large pines. And one of the reasons it's really exciting, it's a bright yellow bird. It's a beautiful bird, but it's an early returning warbler. Most of the warblers that return here are returning in May. And there are just a few that are starting to come back in April. So it's great to sort of hear and see some of those first warblers. So I took a look at eBird because I wanted to try to find a little bit more data about pine warblers, sightings in March compared to April. So eBird is from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It's a citizen science program. And eBird's goal is to gather information in the form of checklists of birds, archive it, and freely share it to power new data-driven approaches to science, conservation, and education. eBird is an amazing tool, and it's free to join, so it's just a great resource. So what I did is I took a screenshot of sightings in the last week of March, and if I was on the website, this is just a screenshot, and I were to hover over any of those blue icons, I could see the date of that sighting. And every one of these was March 31st, or March 30th, or March 29th. And this is 10 years worth of data. And then we go to April, and all of a sudden they're coming back. So this isn't, you'd be really unusual to see it in March, and then they just return in large numbers in April, and it's just great to hear and great to see. There's another bird that sounds a lot like the pine warbler that will be returning soon as well. It's the chipping sparrow. So keep an eye out for habitat. That's one way to tell them apart. And one's a small sparrow-like bird, and one's a bright yellow warbler. So I want to turn to wildflowers and spring ephemerals. They, again, like the vernal pool, like the animals that breed in the vernal pool, it's sort of a race against time. They are these beautiful early in our area, really April, blooming wildflowers in deciduous woods. They need to bloom between snowmelt and leaf out. So that race against time is before all the leaves come out in the canopy in the deciduous forest and shade out these wildflowers down below. So they want a flower, they want that flower to be fertilized, and they want that seed to develop in those 2 months. Praline arbutus is one of the first wildflowers that we'll see other than the cabbage. It's called Mayflower, but it's not because it flowers in the month of May. It flowers in the month of April. You'll see these leathery green leaves, very low, close to the ground, and a tiny pale pink or white flower. If you get it really close, they have an absolutely beautiful smell to them. So again, they're one of our earliest wildflowers that looks like a wildflower. And they were the first wildflower the Pilgrims saw after they survived the first winter. And so they named the wildflower after their ship, Mayflower. Colt's foot is another flower that we should see soon. I usually look for it in early April. It looks a lot like a dandelion, but it's not. The flower comes up. It's in the same family as a dandelion, the composite family. The flower emerges before the leaf. So you'll just see the flowers. The leaf emerges later, and the leaf looks like a colt's foot, which is where it got its name from. The leaf has a lot of mucilage in it. And mucilage can help coat and soothe an irritated throat. And the leaves of colt's foot have long been used as a cough remedy. Hepatica, one of my favorite early spring wildflowers, should see it in the middle, I hope, middle of April. If you look at the leaf, it sort of resembles the shape of a liver. And there's a medical philosophy or a medical practice called the doctrine of signatures that goes back hundreds of thousands of years, and it's true for different cultures throughout the world. So it goes back even before medieval times. So if a plant looked like a part of the body, then it was a good cure for that part of the body. So hence Hepatica, hepatitis, it's all from the Latin word meaning liver. Whether or not it's true or not, whether or not it cures it, hasn't really been proven, but in 1883 in this country, over 450,000 pounds of dried leaves were collected for use domestically as well as exported. 450,000 pounds, and these were dried leaves, so they're going to weigh less than if they're wet. So it was a pretty popular cure. Whether it works or not is doubtful, but it's a beautiful, beautiful wildflower to see. It can come in different colors. It may be white, it may be purple, and it may be pink. Bloodroot's another, and this is another beautiful picture taken by Beth Pelton. If you were to break the stem, it has this bright blood red orange juice inside. That juice is toxic, but it was thought that that would help cure blood diseases. Again, the doctrine of signatures. So one of the challenges for these spring ephemerals is they are blooming so early and there's not a lot of insects. It's difficult both for early insects that emerge and for early plants. So they really want to conserve that pollen and be careful. So on the left, you'll see there's a bloodroot that's closed up. So it will not open its petals because it doesn't want to waste its pollen. It'll do this at night. It'll do this in really cold weather and in damp weather because the insects aren't going to be active that will be pollinated. Trout lily's another. So it can take 6 to 7 years for a trout lily to develop from the seed to the flower. It's a long time for those plants, and they can be quite long-lived. The mottled leaf is where it gets the name, resembles the mottling on a brook trout, hence called trout lily. It grows in wet, damp, rich woods. Mount Toby is a great local place to go take a walk and to see trout lily. So a lot of insects are really, the ones that are out there are really looking for these early flowering wildflowers because that's where there's food, there's nectar, and there's pollen. So here's a video that I took on a walk in Mount Toby of a bee pollinating or visiting in a trout lily. And as I look closely, there was a beetle on top of that trout lily that you can see. There are a couple of different beetles that visit the trout lily to help pollinate it as well. They'll visit the trout lily and then fly to another trout lily. And so they'll move the pollen from one plant to another. So these plants are pretty amazing. There's a symbiotic relationship between ants and a lot of these spring ephemerals. Between the trout lily is one of them. They're on their seeds, so they're trying to develop their seeds, and later in the spring, before the leaves, the trees develop the leaves and they get shaded out and they lose some of their energy. They have these structures called elaiosomes on their seeds. So they make these structures on the seeds that are really high in protein, high in oil, rich in fat, really tasty for ants. So ants will collect these seeds. They'll then carry them back underground to feed their young. The young will feed off of this. They'll feed the seed, eat the elaisome, and then discard the seed. The seed's not hurt. And the seed is sort of planted underground in this compost pile in this ant home and has a head start for germination. So this symbiotic relationship helps the ants feed their young and helps the young of the trout lily or the seed for the next generation get a head start. That same combination also works for the Trillium. So they have elaiosomes as well, and they depend on the ants, and they also depend on flies. So like skunk cabbage, they are looking to imitate rotting meat. So they're looking to imitate carrion, hence that dark maroon color, and hence the name Stinking Benjamin, because they do smell as well, like the skunk cabbage. So if you are that color and you smell, then a fly is going to want to visit you because it's going to think that you're rotting meat, and then it will move your pollen from one plant to another and hopefully pollinate and fertilize that flower. And I'm sure there are other insects that pollinate Trillium as well. I don't know who Benjamin was, but that nickname Stinking Benjamin, I always found funny. So a couple of birds that I'll hear if I'm out in mid-April, late April, looking for some of the spring ephemerals. These are also some birds that may be in that same area, and they're just great to listen for. The winter wren is a tiny bird with a big voice. Another is the hermit thrush, in the same family as the robin and the bluebirds. The thrushes have beautiful, beautiful songs. So these are sounds that I hope to hear in a month or so as April unfolds. But this is a song that I heard today, and I've heard the past couple of weeks. It is the song of the black-capped chickadee, and it is saying spring's here, and it is just a great sound, and we can hear it right now. So if the chickadee's saying spring's here, it definitely must be here. So I hope that you enjoy the arrival of spring. I'd like to close with a quote from Rachel Carson. There's something infinitely healing in the repeated refrains of nature. The assurance that dawn comes after night and spring after winter. In nature, nothing exists alone. And I hope that you enjoy the arrival of spring, looking for and listening to the steady progression of changes and rebirth in the plant and animal world that happen in March and April. Thank you for joining us tonight. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A in the column. We will also be sending out a follow-up email that will have some references, some tools that you may want to use to identify some plants, some tools to identify birds, as well as the link to Bill Dean's photographs. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for the Northfield Bird Club for co-sponsoring the program as well. And have a great time looking for signs of spring in March and April.
Thank you, Kim. While we're waiting for the questions and answers, all of them to come up, could you give us some resources that we can look at? Do you have any resources you can share?
There we go. I have to remember to unmute myself. So these are two. Mary Holland does a blog that's just wonderful, and she's also written a couple of books. Hopefully you can see this, and I'll send this in a resource. So Mary Holland has two books, Naturally Curious and Naturally Curious Day by Day, and they are just great resources to look for and look through, and they sort of go through changes. She's a naturalist that lives in central Vermont, and she goes out and photographs and writes about daily changes. And so that's one wonderful resource. iNaturalist is another. It's an app you can get for your phone, and you can use it to take a picture, and it will identify that tree or that flower or that plant or that animal. So that's a great sort of relatively easy way to start in natural history and learning what that plant is, what that wildflower is. And the other great website is All About Birds through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And there's a free app that you can download called Merlin that you can play bird sounds and learn about the birds.